Hello everyone, and today I am bringing you the entire German naval tech tree review for War Thunder. This is something I've been putting off for a little bit as I have had the line done, but Gaijin was making a lot of changes to the game mode and adding in a few new ships, so I held off and got to actually review Bismarck with this full review. As always, there is a few caveats to this review, as I will only be speaking on researchable ships, not premiums, and I'm primarily an arcade player, but a lot of the things that I do say will apply to realistic, albeit with some of the values tuned down, and obviously I can't speak on the range updates or target acquisition, as they decided to make arcade completely different and not have those anymore, so some of these may be slightly better or slightly worse for realistic gameplay. All these ship reviews are based on having most of their modifications researched or the ship fully spaded, and the reviews themselves will typically be in the order of speed and handling, survivability and anti-aircraft, along with firepower, torpedoes, and then finally a rating, and the rating of course is based on my experience with each ship and how much fun they were for me to grind out. If I don't mention any anti-aircraft in any of these reviews, it's because that ship has very little or none, though the German line is pretty good with that stuff, and so I will be mentioning it in most of the reviews. As far as an overview for the line goes, overall the line seems very complete with no standout missing ships that I can remember, though I am disappointed that Gneisenau ended up being a premium. I really hope they don't decide to do the same thing with Tirpitz. And yes, I'm going to basically Americanize every one of these names, you'll have to bear with me. I do not speak the dialect very well for that, so you'll have to deal with my pronunciation. The German line does have a squadron boat, although it is a coastal, so I won't be reviewing it here, as that would be kind of unfair to it. For the most part, the line is very fun, though many of the battleships can be considered weak for their battle ratings, though the line does make up for this by having certain ships that stand out very heavily at their battle ratings. Overall, the majority of the ships have decent anti-aircraft firepower with good engagement ranges. The line does have a lot of reused guns on different ships, so when we do talk about those, I will primarily be talking about the ammo and the guns on the first ship that has them, but if it is majorly different in terms of battle ratings or differences in the guns and how they perform, I will speak on them during that ship's review. The line does use predominantly one type of torpedo, the same one as the reserve destroyer, but I will speak on that throughout it. But really, if you want the proper review of that torpedo, look at the reserve destroyer. Many of the ships also hold very little ammo, leaving you likely to run out during extended engagements, or forcing you to take full ammo loads and increasing the chance of a magazine detonation. Though it is worth it because your shells do have great velocity and are very strong overall typically. The destroyers are jacks of all trades, though they are primarily like second line ships. They can't really outdo everything else, as they specialize in everything and not one thing in specific. The light cruisers are basically glass cannons, though they are pretty fun in my opinion, and the heavy cruisers are just beasts, though the battleships themselves leave a lot to be desired at times until the end of the line when they get strong again. So TLDR, the majority of the line is very average in good ways, with some very strong ships that stand out from the rest, and most of the battleships are somewhat weak in my opinion. Starting off with the reviews though, we'll start with the reserve ship. This is the Leopard at 3.7. This destroyer is small, fast, and agile, but fairly light on crew. It has three 12.8 centimeter guns, with one being forward and two super firing on the aft. They have great arcs of fire, especially forward, with all but the aft turret being able to rotate 360 degrees. They do, however, tend to be destroyed easily, so be prepared to be repairing these quite often. They aren't the fastest turning guns, but they are pretty workable, and they do have a decent reload speed at about 4 seconds, but they have poor accuracy at longer ranges. The shells themselves have slightly shorter arcs than American destroyers, making them a lot easier to land on targets that are maneuvering, and they are the standard guns for most of the German destroyers, with mainly the mounts changing in between each destroyer. The high explosive shells aren't the strongest, but they can decimate lighter vessels, while the base fuse high explosive shells can overpen small destroyers and light targets, which is a bit weird to use in my opinion, but they're okay overall. The kinda sad part is you don't get the semi-armor piercing or armor piercing that other lines get, but the base fuse high explosive does kinda make up for it in some ways. As for your torpedo loadout, you get 6 torpedoes and 2 triple launchers with great arcs of fire. The torpedoes themselves are fairly slow but pack a very workable warhead, and can have a long reach of up to 14 kilometers with torpedo mode modification, though if you choose not to take this, they're slightly faster and it can only go to about 6 kilometers. My rating overall for the Leopard is a 7 out of 10. It is a very fun start to the line compared to other reserve ships. Moving on from that, we have the T-22, also at 3.7. This is not the fastest destroyer, but it is still quick and turns well. It does have a larger crew than most 3.7 destroyers, which means you will take quite a few more hits than other ships, though they do kinda tend to dwindle rather fast, as most destroyers do. The ship is covered in light anti-aircraft guns, which are fairly effective at warding off planes and coastal boats. As for the main armament, you get 4 10.5 centimeter guns spread across the entire vessel's centerline that feel rather lackluster in many engagements. They tend to be easily destroyed due to being shielded guns and not fully enclosed turrets. They do have good arcs of fire forward, but pretty terrible to the rear. The front turret tends to get blocked by the bridge, and in other cases the bow shape will block the front turret if you're fighting in closer engagements directly over the bow. The other guns do tend to get blocked by miscellaneous deck items randomly, so overall it's kind of frustrating to use these guns effectively without just being fully broadside. They do, however, have a very workable gun traverse speed, about the same as Leopard but slightly slower rate of fire, and the ship does have a low ammo count, so you will be packing your magazines quite full to get through a long match. The base fuse high explosive shells should be your go-to shell for this boat. They aren't the best but can slowly tear ships apart, though they won't outdamage the larger 5-inch armed destroyers that you do face. This thing does lack any semi-armor piercing or armor piercing, much like the Leopard. The shells on it do feel pretty floaty, but are decently accurate, especially compared to the Leopard, and you get 2 triple torpedo tubes with great firing arms. Of course, they do get the same torpedoes as Leopard. My rating for this thing is a 4 out of 10. The anti-aircraft guns are nice, but it really does struggle hard against other destroyers. Up next we have the Z-15 at 4.0. This is where most of the German destroyers start to standardize and just continuously start to get larger. The ship is not great at frontline brawling though, even though it does have that larger side, as it tends to take damage rather quickly, and before you know it you'll just be sinking without any crew. The Z-15 is faster than the previous destroyers and has a large crew, though you can feel the size increase in the larger turning radius. The rudder response though is very good, and it is very quick to start its turns, making it fairly good at dodging enemy fire. The ship is also fast to accelerate, though due to its size it's somewhat slow to decelerate compared to other destroyers. The anti-aircraft on it is pretty effective with decent range, and it will surprise a lot of pilots in coastal boats with the damage it can put out, and at the ranges it can put out. As for the main battery, you have 4 of the same 12.8 centimeter guns that the Leopard has, with 2 super firing forward and 2 super firing aft. They don't have the best firing arcs, but they are workable, and they have the same decent rotation speed as Leopard. though like I said with that ship, they are easily destroyed due to just being shielded turrets. It also gets the same shells as Leopards with the same okay performance, though like I said with Leopard, they can feel kind of anemic at times against other destroyers. The Z-15 also can't store a ton of shells on board and can run out quite easily, especially if you're taking multiple ammo types at the same time. And finally, it does have the same torpedoes as Leopard, but it gets 8 of them into quad launchers with good firing arcs. Rating overall for the Z-15 is a 5 out of 10. The anti-aircraft is nice, but the guns can struggle to deal with other destroyers efficiently. Moving up in battle ratings, we have the K2 at 4.3. This is kind of an oddity as it's a frigate in the Blue Water Line. It has to really choose its engagements due to this, as it won't outgun most destroyers, and it's best when fighting coastals for objectives. It's rather small and slow, but it does turn well and has crew counts on par with most destroyers. And it can tank a surprising amount of damage despite being smaller, as it does require all 4 hull sections to be destroyed in order to sink. So you will tank a lot of shells from enemy ships where they just can't really kill you. That being said, you can struggle to get to the objectives due to your speed and being forced to use the destroyer spawn locations, which gives them a lot of time to shoot at you because you're a very slow and exposed target. On top of that, you have less anti-aircraft than Z-15, though it is still quite effective. As far as your main battery goes, you have 2 twin 120mm turrets on either end of the ship with improved traverse rates over the previous destroyers. However, you do get only high explosive shells, but these high explosive shells do have more explosives than the 12.8cm destroyer shells, and can be fairly destructive, though sometimes you won't really get the internal modules on other ships just because they're not penetrating at all. The reload for them is long at 7 seconds, and the shells are pretty floaty and take a long time to reach targets at range, so if an enemy ship is dipping and dodging, you're going to have a lot of trouble trying to hit them, especially with that reload time. This is a destroyer that gets secondaries though, and it gets 2 twin 3.7cm secondaries in the center of the ship that do get armor piercing ammo and are decent at sniping modules on enemy vessels. The 3.7cm shells have shorter flight arcs and reload fast at about 2 seconds per shot. Overall, you have great firing arcs on all of your batteries, though the front 3.7 does get blocked by the bridge when firing towards the rear. Also, this ship does not get torpedoes, which would be nice to fight larger ships at, especially at those closer ranges where you could surprise them and take them out quickly rather than trying to shoot off their guns with your high explosive ammo and just survive. My rating overall for the K2 is a 6 out of 10. It is fun to play it like a rat, but it is dreadfully slow to get to cover on the larger maps that you can have. Up next we have the Z12, also at 4.3. This is very similar to Z15, but it loses the anti-aircraft for more guns. This does not make it a frontline dueler though. It does have similar size and maneuverability to Z15 with the fast speeds and long turns, and the same large crew count. It does list very hard in turns though, which can prevent your guns from getting on target sometimes. It uses the same 12.8cm turrets as Z15, but it does get an extra one facing forward on the aft. It has the same good firing arcs and decent traverse speeds as Z15, and same OK shells as well, and tends to be fairly accurate. It does carry 120 more rounds of ammo, though it is still not much to feed 5 guns with if you are mixing your ammo types. It gains 2 twin 3.7cm mounts, the same guns as K2, one on either side of the ship. The decent rate of fire and the armor piercing makes them very good for sniping modules on enemy ships, though they lack much broadside weight. A notable aspect of these guns, however, is they have a slightly better shell arc than the 12.8cm shells, so at closer ranges they will tend to get to enemy ships faster. All the guns on Z12 are easily destroyed due to being shielded or just fully exposed, so be prepared to be repairing these fairly constantly. As far as your torpedo loadout goes, you have 8 of the standard OK German torpedoes and 2 quad launchers with good firing arcs. My rating overall for the Z12 is a 5 out of 10. The extra gun helps it fight other destroyers a bit better, but still not very effectively. After Z12 we have the Z22, also at 4.3. This is effectively a larger Z12 with the anti-aircraft being added back and listing issues fixed. It keeps the speed, but the turning performance on it is slightly worse, probably due to the listing actually getting fixed. The anti-aircraft guns are enough to ward off some planes, but don't expect them to swat everything, and the main batteries do have better forward firing arcs than the Z12. Everything else on the ship is basically the same. Rating overall for the Z22 is a 5 out of 10. Despite the improvements, it feels very much like you're just playing the same ship. Bumping up in BR once again, we have the Z32 at 4.7, and finally it's something a bit different. This is similar in speed and turning performance to Z22, though it does have a slightly larger crew count. It does still, however, take damage very quickly, so you will still not want to use this as a frontline ship, for this reason among a few others that we'll speak on in a moment. The anti-aircraft firepower is okay, it's nothing amazing. It's very similar to Z22 as well in this regard. As far as your main battery is concerned, you get 5 15cm guns in one twin forward mount and 3 on the aft in a similar layout to the previous destroyers. These 15cm guns basically turn you into a miniature cruiser with good firepower but longer reloads, which are about 8 seconds. The turrets do traverse a bit faster than the previous destroyers, and while it is noticeable, it's not a massive improvement in my opinion. The main batteries themselves have fairly poor firing arcs and tend to be blocked by the superstructure and bridge, forcing you to show a full broadside, but you are compensated by them being fairly accurate. As for your rounds, you get a choice between semi-armor piercing and high explosive, and both of them are similar in explosive filler amounts and viable to use. The semi-armor piercing rounds can damage cruisers if they're aimed at weak spots or at closer ranges, but at longer ranges you may struggle against them. The shells are noticeably faster and have lower arcs than the previous destroyers you have been playing. They are very good for sneaking in surprise alpha strikes against other destroyers, but not great for brawling due to their reload speed. As far as your ammo storage goes, it is similar to the other destroyers, though it's less of a problem as you do have that slower rate of fire that you are contending with. You do still get the same twin 3.7cm mounts for your secondaries as the other destroyers, with 1 on each side of your ship, and your torpedoes are the typical OK German torpedoes, getting 8 of them and 2 quad launchers with good firing arcs. My rating for this is a 7 out of 10. The micro cruiser life is rather fun in my opinion. Up next we have the Z43, also at 4.7. This is another standard German destroyer, just slightly bigger once again. It's very similar to Z22. It has a similar speed and turning abilities, along with fast acceleration but slow deceleration like the rest of the destroyers. This one also has listing problems and can prevent the guns from firing during fast turns, and still takes damage rather quickly, which is a bit of a pain because you are a larger target. The anti-aircraft batteries though are enhanced over Z22's, making it effective at taking out planes at decent ranges. The guns themselves for your main batteries are the same as all the previous 12.8cm German destroyers, so basically the same as the reserve ship, in the same shielded turrets, making them very easy to knock out, though they still do have decent accuracy. It gets 5 of these guns in the same layout as Z22, but has slightly worse firing arcs. It gets the same exact shells as the rest of the 12.8cm destroyers, and they're feeling very anemic at this point, especially against cruisers. It also gets the same low ammunition storage amount, especially if you're still mixing shell types, which I do suggest. As far as your secondaries go, you still get the same twin 3.7cm secondary batteries on both sides of the ship, though you can fire both to one side at certain angles. Your torpedo battery is still the same OK German torpedoes, getting 8 of them into quad launchers with good firing arcs still. My rating overall for this is a 5 out of 10, it just feels like a bigger version of the rest of the standard German destroyers. Rounding off our destroyers, we have the Z-46, also at 4.7. This is the first German destroyer to have an armored hull and enclosed 12.8cm turrets, which it took them a while to get here in my opinion. It is similar in speed and acceleration to the previous destroyers, but it does have a larger turning circle due to being slightly larger. The Z-46 keeps the same large crew that the other destroyers had and adds a lightly armored deck and hull around important components. The added armor protection does make it feel slightly tankier against destroyer fire, although cruisers will just eat you alive. As far as your anti-aircraft goes, it is very similar to Z-43, so it is fairly effective at taking out planes at decent ranges. As far as your main battery is concerned though, you boast 6 improved 12.8cm guns in 3 twin turrets, with 1 being forward and 2 super firing aft. These turrets are enclosed, making them survive slightly better than what you had previously, and the traverse speeds are about the same as Z-32, so noticeably faster but not significant, but decent regardless. One downside, however, is you only get standard high explosive shells that are slightly improved over previous destroyers. In my opinion, they're fairly underwhelming when you're fighting most cruisers or large destroyers, though they can decimate lighter ships. It's just kind of a pain that you only get high explosive instead of something that can penetrate and damage interior modules a little bit better. The shell flights themselves are similar to the other 12.8cm armed destroyers and are somewhat floaty feeling in my opinion, though you do get a faster rate of fire at just over 3 seconds per reload, and the guns are fairly accurate. This ship does run out of ammo fairly easily despite having larger storages, forcing you to take full ammo loadouts and really increase that chance of just getting detonated. As far as your torpedoes go, you get 2 quad launchers with the standard OK German torpedoes, and an extra 4 torpedoes for a quick reload. The firing arcs on these are fairly good, though they are better to the rear if you're fighting an engagement where you have to run away. My rating overall is a 6 out of 10. It's basically a discount Akizuki, and somewhat a struggle when you're facing larger ships. Moving away from the destroyers then, first up we have the SMS Elbing, also at 4.7. This is on the slower side for the early cruisers, but it is extremely maneuverable and has tighter turns than even the Z-46. It is quite small for an early cruiser as well, helping it dodge enemy fire, and the average crew size for early cruisers definitely helps you with survivability as well. As far as your armor goes, you have a turtleback armor scheme below the waterline, but it is fairly thin, and the rest of the ship is unarmored, which makes you take a lot of damage rather quickly, even if your internals aren't penetrated, which that turtleback isn't really stopping much at this point. It is noteworthy that this ship does not take torpedo hits very well, and most will just outright sink you. It can also list and prevent the guns from firing during some heavier turns, so if you are using your maneuverability, you might not be able to fire back at the enemies due to this. As far as your main batteries are concerned, you have 8 single 150mm guns with 4 on each side of the ship. You can get a broadside of 5 of these at certain forward angles if you have it just right and are advancing on the enemy. These do have good firing arcs, and you can typically keep at least 3 on target no matter what angle you are holding with your ship. The turrets, however, do rotate slowly and are beaten out even by many Japanese destroyers, which are known for their slow turret traverse. These guns do have a fairly average rate of fire with a 10-second reload, but they do feel really slow when destroyers can just pick you apart rapidly due to your lack of armor. These turrets are also only shielded and easily taken out, and overall aren't very accurate in my opinion. The shell flight times are similar to destroyers and feel very floaty for a cruiser, especially one where you really don't have that much offensive firepower to begin with due to the lack of accuracy and reload speed. The Elbing does get access to high explosive, semi-armor piercing, and armor piercing shells, though they all have a rather small explosive filler, so they lack a lot of punch when they hit their target. The armor piercing and semi-armor piercing are extremely similar per explosive filler, but you'll want to take both as the semi-armor piercing doesn't penetrate cruisers very well, and the armor piercing tends to over-penetrate destroyers. Some high explosive is also recommended to ward off any coastal boats that try to rush you down. These guns really do tend to struggle to deal damage against larger cruisers, and really you just don't want to be fighting other cruisers straight up in my opinion. It does get 4 single 52mm secondaries with 2 per side. In my opinion, they're not super useful and they have a very slow rate of fire with about a 6-second reload. At certain angles you can get all 4 firing over certain sides, but like I said, it's not super useful. As far as your torpedoes go, you get 2 single torpedo launchers with 1 per side in the middle of the ship. They do have great firing arcs, especially to the rear of the ship, but the torpedoes themselves are pretty much terrible. They're very slow, they have tiny warheads, and 5-kilometer range. I still recommend taking them for close range encounters with bigger cruisers, but really they're just emergency use, and I wouldn't expect much out of them. My rating overall for this is a 2 out of 10. It's like a bigger destroyer, but worse in most ways. Up next we have the Emden at 5.0. This is slightly faster than Elbing and still very maneuverable, but you can feel its increased size in the turns and acceleration. It has a thicker turtleback scheme than Elbing with some belt armor added as well, though it is still light and leaves most of the ship unarmored, so you will take significant damage from ships just repeatedly shelling you. It does, however, gain a significant amount of crew members over Elbing, helping it take more of these hits, even though, like I said, your armor is going to leave you wanting. It does not, however, take torpedo hits very well, and most will sink it. It does list fairly heavily in turns, which can prevent the guns from engaging enemy targets while you're trying to maneuver to avoid their fire. And you do have an effective suite of anti-aircraft guns that will engage at a good distance and will shred planes and coastal boats. As far as your main batteries are concerned, you have the same guns as Z32 in 8 single batteries. 2 of these are super firing forward, 2 on each side of the ship, and 2 super firing aft with decent rotation speeds and firing arcs. At most you can engage with 6 of these guns at a time. The turrets, however, are still only shielded and lightly armored and are easily destroyed, so be prepared to be repairing these fairly constantly. They have mediocre accuracy, but having more guns than Elbing does help. Emden does get a faster rate of fire with just over 8 seconds per reload, and noticeably faster shell flight times than Elbing, also helping with the mediocre accuracy in my opinion. You get the same effective high explosive and semi-armor piercing shells as Z32 with improved explosive filler amounts over Elbing. You also get armor piercing ammo as well for fighting other cruisers, though it does lose a lot of filler for penetration. Typically I would take mostly semi-armor piercing with some armor piercing and a handful of high explosive for warding off the coastal boats. As far as your secondaries go, you get 3 single 10.5cm secondaries in midships, and you can use 2 on each broadside. Secondaries can get semi-armor piercing ammo that can help damage lighter vessels, and they do have a good rate of fire. You do get torpedoes as well with 2 twin torpedo launchers, 1 per side with the typical OK German torpedoes, and these things have awesome firing arcs. My rating overall for the Emden is a 7 out of 10. It is very good at bullying destroyers, but it is not great for straight up cruiser fights. After that we have Leipzig at 5.3. As far as its maneuverability is concerned, this thing is fast, though it is only about average for light cruisers. For turning, it is very responsive to rudder inputs, but it does have a very wide turning circle that you have to keep in mind when you're actually trying to go somewhere on the map, or turn around to avoid an engagement. It does have a high crew count, almost on par with 6.0 cruisers, but tends to lose crew fairly quickly due to being very lightly armored. And its armor is fairly ineffective at stopping most shells. Even many destroyers will pen you if you're not angled. Your magazines are very easy to detonate on this thing. The ship does have torpedo protection, but it is also fairly ineffective as well. Most torpedoes will just outright sink you. On top of that, your anti-aircraft armament is rather light. It can swat a few planes, but you really aren't the hardest target. As far as your main batteries go, you get 9 15cm guns in 3 triple turrets, 1 forward and 2 super firing on the aft. The aft turrets can rotate 360 degrees, making swapping sides or weaving while you're advancing extremely easy, and they have a similar good rate of fire to Emden. They have great firing arcs, but are slightly slower to traverse than the 12.8cm destroyers, so they are kinda subpar, but manageable. It shares Emden shells, but has slightly better penetration and shell velocity, so to touch on those again, you'll have fairly effective semi-armor piercing and high explosive, with armor penetrating ammo whose explosive filler leaves a bit to be desired. Taking mostly semi-armor piercing with some armor piercing to deal with heavier targets is suggested. Early battleships though will shrug off a lot of your fire, so it is best to avoid them in my opinion. Your shell velocity and accuracy will take a lot of people by surprise at closer ranges, and your velocity is very fast, like I said, and leaves very little room for them to dodge, while you are fairly maneuverable and can dodge their fire. Your ammo storage is small, so you may run out in drawn out games, especially when carrying multiple types of shells. Just keep that in mind if you're just flinging shells across the map without really worrying about hitting targets. It gets 3 twin 8.8cm secondaries near midships, and you can use 2 of them per side. They have a fast rate of fire, but they're not super effective against blue water ships, and they tend to be fairly easily destroyed as they have no shielding. You also don't get any torpedoes, which is a bit of an oddity as most of this line tends to have those. And they are fairly nice if you encounter something at a close range that you can't quickly kill. My rating overall on this is an 8 out of 10. It's a glass cannon, but it is a fun and effective glass cannon. Jumping up a bit in battle rating, we have the Nurnberg at 5.7. This is folded with Leipzig, so it is optional for continuing down the line. It's basically an improved Leipzig, though it does lose some minor turn response due to being heavier. It has slightly improved armor, but it's still really not enough to stop anything, though it does gain even more crew members due to having a lot more added anti-aircraft guns. It makes the anti-aircraft gun suite extremely effective at decent ranges and allows you to take a few extra hits, even though, like I said, your armor's not going to stop any of those. The turrets are very slightly quicker to traverse than Leipzig, but you're really not going to notice this because it is extremely small, and it doesn't fix the small magazine storage issue, and it tends to run out in drawn out games. It gains an extra twin 8.8cm secondary, but you can still only use 2 twin mounts per broadside. It does, however, gain 2 triple torpedo tubes, 1 on each side of the ship, with great arcs of fire, and uses the standard OK German torpedoes. The higher battle rating though means it does face a lot more heavily armored targets that its armor piercing struggles to deal with. Overall, my rating for this is a 6 out of 10. It's improved, but the higher battle rating definitely hurts it. Going back down in battle rating, we have the Koln at 5.3. This ship is very comparable to Leipzig, though it does have some major differences. It has lighter armor, no torpedo protection, and slightly less crew than Leipzig, which does hurt your survivability a little bit, but the armor really wasn't helping you in the first place, so it's not really much of a loss. A big loss though is you have an even lighter anti-aircraft suite than Leipzig, which leaves a lot to be desired. You do get the same guns and shells as Leipzig, but the rear super firing turrets are offset from each other, which is a very funky design when you're just looking at it. It makes your forward firing arcs great over the right side of your ship and terrible over the left, forcing you to be almost broadside to fire all three main batteries to the left. The rear firing arcs are still the same as Leipzig, so good overall. It's just you have to kind of plan your engagements a little bit more and try to engage more over the right side of the ship, where you can swing the turrets out a little bit easier than over the left side. You still have the same small magazine storage size, so you will tend to run out of shells in a long battle. And your torpedo armament is quite a bit bigger. You get 4 triple torpedo tubes with 2 on each side of the ship, with great firing arcs. They are the standard OK German torpedoes that you've had since Leopard. My rating overall for the Koln is an 8 out of 10. The firing arcs may be wonky sometimes, but the torpedoes are a great addition. Climbing up to a battle rating of 6.0, we have the Admiral Hipper, and this is truly one of the highlights of the line in my opinion. This thing is twice as heavy as the light cruisers you have been playing, but still just as fast, ergo you'll be about average as far as cruisers go. You do feel the weight in the acceleration and the long, wide turns that it has, as it feels more similar to a fast battleship in those two regards. The armor on this thing is actually effective for once, and finally has a lot of anti-fragmentation armor that'll save a lot of your crew from those minor penetrating hits. Angling this armor can bounce some battleships, but the later 12-inch or bigger guns will straight up decimate this ship. The armor can frustrate many cruisers, though others can quickly whittle away your crew with fast rate of fire high explosive throwing guns like, say, Cleveland's. It does however get an extremely large crew count that rivals even late battleships, which will significantly help with that survivability. The modules themselves, the important ones at least, are deep in the hull, though the magazines do stick up above the waterline, but they have a very thin side profile and are fairly compact, which makes them somewhat difficult just to hit offhand. The anti-aircraft firepower on the Admiral Hipper is good, but the large superstructure on the ship can block many of your guns at certain angles and allow the planes to get through. Your torpedo protection and fuel tank placement does allow you to survive some torpedo hits, so while you don't want to sit there and tank torpedoes left and right, you have a much better chance of surviving them than the previous light cruisers that you have been playing. As far as your firepower is concerned, you get 8 20.3 centimeter guns in 4 twin turrets, with 2 super firing on each end of the ship. They have a 14-second reload, which makes it one of the fastest reloading heavy cruisers, of course not counting the USS Des Moines, and they are fairly accurate. The turrets turn just as fast as Nurnberg's, so about the same as every other German cruiser and extremely fast for a heavy cruiser. These turrets also get great arcs of fire, especially with how large the ship is, which allows you to angle well or prepare to angle even more while you are firing. The shells from these guns have very fast flight times with very flat arcs, and are even faster than the light cruisers or even the Japanese heavy cruisers, and can take very many people by surprise if they don't think your shells can get to them as fast as they do. The shells, however, do have a similar dilemma to the light cruisers, as the armor piercing has high pen, but only okayish explosive filler, and overpens lighter targets very often in my opinion. The semi-armor piercing, however, has great filler, but half the penetration, so taking an equal mix of both is recommended from me, and you can basically ditch all the high explosive. As far as your secondaries go, you get 6 twin 10.5 centimeter guns with 3 on each side of the ship. These are easily destroyed as they're shielded targets, but they are somewhat useful. The shells have similar velocities to the main guns and can be rather effective in my opinion. I do suggest sticking with the HE shells as the armor-piercing shells are almost solid shot with very minimal filler. The 4-second reload is basically like having a destroyer strapped to each side of your ship in my opinion, so overall, very good. It also gets 4 triple torpedo launchers with 2 on each flank of the ships, around midships. These have great arcs of fire with the standard OK German torpedoes. As far as this ship is concerned, torpedo mode is optional for your playstyle, as leaving it off is better for 6-kilometer or less brawls, while putting it on gives you some extra surprises for the enemy at 14 kilometers, albeit with a bit slower torpedoes. And on top of all that, you get a float plane for snagging capture points. So my rating overall for the Admiral Hipper is a 10 out of 10. This thing is a beast that I did not want to remove from my lineup during my grind. Moving away from that though, we have the Admiral Graf Spee at 6.0. This cruiser is moderately slower, though it does handle its turns like Admiral Hipper, so rather large and lengthy turns. It does list heavily and can prevent your guns from firing in certain hard turns. As far as your armor is concerned though, the belt armor can be effective but is extremely short, and most of the upper hull is unarmored. It tends to be an easy target for faster firing cruisers just to chew up, especially with the clustered anti-aircraft and secondary batteries around midships. Early battleships can be bounced if you're angled, but for the most part your armor is paper to anything with large guns. As far as the crew size goes, it's fairly average for 6.0 cruisers, and they tend to disappear quickly due to the aforementioned reasons of the armor. The anti-aircraft firepower is light for 6.0, but it does have some 10.5 centimeter guns mixed into it, which will one-shot most things if it does hit, and will engage any blue water ships that you are targeting. The torpedo protection though may save you from some torpedoes unless one of your main magazines are hit, so as long as you can maneuver to at least avoid those areas getting smashed with a torpedo, you have a pretty decent chance of surviving it. As far as your firepower is concerned, your main battery consists of 6 283mm guns in 2 triple turrets, with 1 forward and 1 aft. These are similar to Scharnhorst's, but not exactly the same. They are slightly slower to turn than Hipper's guns, so fast for their size with a long 28-second reload. They are, however, not very accurate, and the dispersion will frustrate you even at closer ranges. The turrets themselves do have great armor protection though. One downside of these big turrets is they do have fairly poor arcs of fire, which force you to show a lot of broadside in order to engage with both turrets. The shells themselves have decently flat arcs with velocities and flight times that are just barely longer than Admiral Hipper's. The high explosive shells carry a lot of explosive power, while the semi-armor piercing still has a very hefty explosive charge, though the penetration is only a bit more than Hipper's smaller semi-armor piercing rounds. The armor piercing rounds have battleship levels of penetration and decent filler, but will overpen lighter targets and tend to bounce on angled targets. Taking a mix of the semi-armor piercing and armor piercing is recommended, as you can face both light ships that your armor piercing won't damage, and heavy cruisers or battleships that won't get scratched by your semi-armor piercing. As far as your secondaries go, you get 8 15cm guns with 4 on each side of the ship. These are Emden's guns with longer barrels, giving them more velocity and penetration despite using the same shells. 8-second reload feels a bit long for secondaries, and the shielded turret design is easily destroyed and forces you to repair these turrets a lot. They do, however, have great arcs of fire, especially forward, though they do turn rather slowly. I do suggest taking the semi-armor piercing rounds for these, as the armor piercing will overpen too many of the light targets you can see and just not damage battleships. As far as torpedoes go, you get 2 quad launchers with the standard OK German torpedoes, 1 on each side of the ship at the very aft. They have OK forward firing arcs, but are very good to the rear. And much like Admiral Hipper, the torpedo mode mod is very optional depending on whether or not you brawl with it. And to top it all off, you can get a float plane for taking capture points. My rating overall for this is a 4 out of 10. It has the potential for awesome alpha strikes, but not the accuracy to actually accomplish them. And now we move on to the battleships with the SMS Westfalen at 6.0. This battleship has slow speed and acceleration, although in terms of the early battleships it's about average. The turns are long and excessively slow, which is something you should keep in mind when you're actually trying to avoid obstacles on the map. It does have a decent reverse speed though, and turns about the same in reverse, so unlike other battleships, early battleships especially, say like the US ones, you can actually maneuver in reverse if you have to fight somebody while, trying to retreat without turning your ship around. The armor on this thing can stand up to cruisers and other early battleships, but is paper to battleships you can see in an up tier. And I mean this in the absolute glass cannon effect, because any up tier battleship that sees you will look at you like free food. This ship is low to the water though and compact, which gives less area for these ships to shoot at, especially the ones that have very poor accuracy. The major downside of this ship is the multiple magazines that are spread along the length of the ship, which makes it a lot easier to detonate. The short ammo elevators are also a major risk due to fire spreading going through them fairly quickly straight to your magazines. This ship also has no torpedo protection, but it does have a thick armor belt, but torpedoes will most likely detonate your numerous magazines that you have, so it won't help you anyway. As far as your crew goes, it is about average for early battleships, and the fact that you don't really have any deck modules makes crew loss due to HE spamming rather minimal. And you basically have no anti-aircraft on top of that. The 88mm anti-aircraft guns that you do have on your deck will be firing on whatever you are targeting, usually to minimal effect, and aren't super effective for anti-aircraft batteries. As far as your firepower is concerned, your main battery consists of 6 twin 283mm guns, with 1 on the front, 1 on the aft, and 2 on each side as wing turrets. You get a maximum of 8 barrels on target per broadside, and while the guns are light, they do have a fast fire rate for a battleship, with a 23-second reload. The turrets themselves are slow to rotate, but are above average for battleships in general. The arcs of fire on them though aren't amazing, forcing you to be almost broadside to fire a full 8-round salvo. The shells themselves don't have the velocity that Graf Spee's did, but do have fairly fast flight times in general, though they are lacking in the accuracy department. They also share the same problem as Graf Spee, where the semi-armor piercing shells have good filler but lack penetration against heavier armor, while the AP shells tend to have decent filler but can overpenetrate light targets, and really tend to dislike penetrating angled targets. In my opinion, the armor piercing shells should be your primary shell, with a decent reserve of semi-armor piercing for lighter targets. The ship does have lower ammo storage counts, so you may find taking a full ammo load is preferable to just running out. Your stock shells are semi-armor piercing, which does make the grind easier versus the other battleships that start with high explosive. And as far as your secondaries go, they are split caliber, which is different, with 12 150mm guns mounted in casemates with 6 per side, and 12 faster firing 88mm guns in open emplacements, also 6 per side. The 88mm guns tend to be destroyed constantly and don't deal much damage unless they're used against coastal, so you'll be mainly reliant on the 150mm guns. Those 150mm turrets do have a slow rate of fire with a 10-second reload, but have similar shell flight times to the main batteries below 10 kilometers. The 88mm guns do have a 4-second reload but a noticeably higher shell arc. If you do want to utilize the most secondaries at once though, you have to be basically broadside in order to bring them all to bear. It's just the nature of how this ship is designed. And as far as shell choice, I would go for the armor-piercing shell for the 150mm guns, as it gives them great penetration for secondary batteries while only losing a small amount of explosive filler compared to the semi-armor-piercing rounds that they can get. They will reliably damage most cruisers and lighter armored battleships with those armor-piercing rounds, and I would say just go with those for them. My rating overall for this ship is a 5 out of 10. It is powerful in down tiers, but it really does struggle against larger battleships. After that comes the SMS Von der Tann at 6.0 as well. It is very similar to Westfalen in many ways. It is significantly faster though, keeping up with slower cruisers with a similar large slow turn to Westfalen. It has less armor overall than Westfalen, which will fend off most cruisers but is much more likely to be penetrated by any other battleship. It does however contain more crew but virtually no anti-aircraft guns, as it loses the 88mm anti-aircraft guns that Westfalen had. The main battery consists of only 4 twin 283mm guns, which are the same guns as Westfalen, with one on the front, one on the aft, and 2 positioned on the wings offset from each other. This does allow for an 8-gun broadside, but you do have to be basically fully broadside to accomplish this. The ship itself can act as spaced armor if the enemy is firing at the turret on the far side of your ship, but you do have a lot of magazines that they can hit very easily. This also has the same issue as Westfalen, where the short ammo elevators make it very easy just to spread fires to your magazines. The shells are also the same as Westfalen, so still requires all the ammo storage to be filled or not run out of shells, because you need to split between armor piercing and semi-armor piercing. This also gets the same secondaries as Westfalen, though you do lose 2 of the 150mm casemates and gain 4 88mm in open turrets. It's not a great trade in my opinion, and you still have to be broadside to utilize most of your secondaries at once. This ship can take hull-mounted torpedoes as well, but I really don't suggest it. They are extremely slow, and they have an extremely small explosive payload. So overall my rating of this is 5 out of 10. The speed is nice, but the firing arcs can be rather frustrating to use. Stepping it up a little bit more, we have the SMS Helgoland at 6.7. This is basically a bigger, better armed, and better armored Westfalen. It keeps the same speed as Westfalen despite the larger size, and still reverses fairly well too. The turns are still long and slow, but the turning circle is slightly larger due to your larger size. The armor itself is only slightly thicker, but the heavier plates cover larger areas of the ship compared to Westfalen, and the coal bunkers are arranged to cover most of the essential components as well. It feels like paper and up tier still, especially to plunging fire that you're really not armored against, but you do have more crew than Westfalen, but not quite as many as Von der Tann, and still absolutely no anti-aircraft, which is a major deficit at these tiers. So you do feel a lot stronger in terms of survivability versus Westfalen, but you still are fairly vulnerable. As far as torpedo protection goes, you have none of that, but you do have thick side armor, and the coal bunker placement can aid against torpedoes, but the numerous magazines that you have make it easy for a torpedo just to straight up detonate you. Like I said, with the many spread out magazines with Westfalen, you have the same issue here. They are a massive detonation risk, along with continuing to have short ammo elevators, which makes fire spreading extremely quick and an extreme hazard to your magazines. As far as your main battery goes, you get 12 305mm guns in 6 twin turrets. You get 1 forward, 1 aft, and 2 on each side, and they're very similar to layout to Westfalen. 8-gun broadside maximum as well, very reminiscent of the previous ships. The guns are bigger, but still quite small for the battle rating. They do retain the 23-second reload time though, which is a major pro in my opinion. The turrets are slightly slower to rotate, but still good for battleship turrets, and the arcs of fire are rather good, letting you angle the ship heavily towards wherever you're engaging, and bait shots into your heavily armored belt. These guns also seem a lot more accurate than the previous ships. The shells themselves keep the same speed and flight arc as Westfalen's, and in my opinion the armor-piercing shells should be taken primarily, as they gained significant amounts of filler and some penetration over the previous battleships. Some semi-armor piercing can be taken as it now has significantly more penetration, but has less filler than the armor-piercing rounds. Overall, in my opinion, both shells have very inconsistent damage and dislike penetrating armored targets at longer ranges. I do still suggest to fill your ammo storage to almost full, as the numerous turrets spreads your ammo out and can run you dry fairly quickly. As far as your secondaries go, you have the same secondaries as Westfalen, with 14 of the 150mm guns in casemates and 14 of the 88mm guns in open turrets, with 8 on each side for both of these. You still have to be broadside to utilize most of these secondaries at once though. And along the same lines as Westfalen, I don't suggest taking the hull-mounted torpedoes, as they are extremely slow and have no yield. They just add to your detonation chance, which is already pretty high. My rating overall for the Helgoland is a 3 out of 10. Being a helpless damage pinata at range sucks. Continuing on with the 6.7s, we have the SMS Derfflinger. This is a significant break from the typical German battleship battlecruiser designs that we've had so far, going to a more standard look. The ship is also much faster, being able to match slower cruisers, and responds well to rudder inputs, even though it has a very wide turning circle due to the long and skinny hull design. The armor itself is similar to Helgoland and generally feels the same, although the more standard magazine placement certainly helps, as your entire battleship isn't just one big explosion risk. As an added bonus, the extremely long bow and stern in front of the first and last turrets can act as great spaced armor if your ship is pointing directly at the enemy ship at closer ranges. As far as the crew concerns, you have an average crew size, having slightly more than Helgoland, which certainly helps with your survivability. Derfflinger's anti-aircraft battery consists of 4 88mm anti-aircraft guns, basically leaving you with no anti-aircraft protection. These will, however, engage enemy blue water ships, even though they don't really do too much. As far as torpedo protection goes, you have none of that, but you still have thick side armor, good coal bunker placement, and the long and empty bow and stern, which means torpedoes will either be mitigated or not deal any significant damage. Just don't take torpedoes near your magazines if you can help it. The shell rooms on the ship are at the waterline, which makes them fairly likely to catch stray shells while also being stacked right on top of the magazines. And the ammo elevators are also still short, which makes fire spreading faster and a lot more dangerous. Both of these being fairly negative aspects of your survivability. As far as your main batteries go, you have the same guns and shells as Helgoland, with 2 twin turrets super firing forward and 2 super firing aft. The aft turrets have a large space in between them, which can throw off people that are trying to aim for your rear magazines and just landing shells in that empty gap between your 2 turrets. These turrets do have great firing arcs for a battleship, letting you fire all your guns while staying very heavily angled. Though you still have to almost fill your magazines with shells to last a long round, if you don't sink, in order to not run dry. As another oddball downside as well, this is the only ship in the tech tree that requires the main gun's semi-armor piercing shells to be researched before the armor piercing shells can be, which just means you have to spend more time with a less good shell before you can actually research the better one, and is kind of just a waste of RP in my opinion. Your secondaries are all 150mm guns, which are the same guns as Helgoland, with 12 total, 6 per side in casemates. You're still forced to go mostly broadside to use all 6, but you can use 4 if heavily angled forward, and only 2 if heavily angled and firing behind you. And just like Helgoland, I still wouldn't bother bringing the hull-mounted torpedoes. Rating overall for the Derfflinger is a 5 out of 10, at least the speed lets you choose your engagements and gets closer while dodging fire. Moving on to the last of the 6.7s, we have the SMS Kaiser. This is once again heavily comparable to Helgoland. It's slightly bigger and faster, but still nowhere near Derfflinger for either one. The armor on Kaiser is definitely better than Helgoland, mainly with the belt armor being thicker, and you can definitely feel the difference at closer ranges with on-par ships, especially if you're able to angle or bait their shells into your belt armor. You do have slightly less crew though, which is a small hit to your survivability. Your turns do feel fairly similar despite the increased speed, and your torpedo protection is exactly like Helgoland. You have none, but you have thick side armor. The spread out magazine still means you're very likely to just detonate anyways, and just like everything else so far, you have absolutely no anti-aircraft firepower. The hull-mounted 88mm guns that were secondaries on previous ships are automatic on this one, which is an odd change. And they could engage slow, low-moving planes, but it's kind of unlikely. The guns on this are the same as Helgoland, but arranged more like Von der Tann's, with twin turrets with one forward, two as wing turrets offset from each other, and two super-firing aft. They all can be fired over one side for a 10-gun broadside, but you do have to be virtually flat broadside to bring all your guns to bear. The gun layout does make it very hard to angle and engage effectively with more than 3 turrets. You also have the same issues as Helgoland with the short ammo elevators, low ammo storage amounts, and the spread out magazines, making you a lot easier to detonate. The secondaries are also the same 150mm guns as Helgoland with 14 casemates and 7 per side. These have decent arcs of fire and can usually keep 5 on target even while you're significantly angled. And to continue with the similarities, the torpedoes are the same terrible ones as Helgoland, so just don't bother bringing them. My rating overall is a 4 out of 10. It's better than Helgoland, but is still awkward to position for full broadsides. Moving up to 7.0, we have the SMS Bayern. This keeps a similar speed to Kaiser, being slightly below average for the 7.0 battleships, and the turns feel very similar as well, with long, slow, wide turns, though it does have a very delayed rudder response before it starts the turn. The armor is very similar to Kaiser as well, with some minor portions and the turret barbettes getting small increases. It can tank a lot of hits from lower tier battleships, but falters hard against on par or larger battleships. And this is especially true at range, where it really struggles to stop anything. The magazines on the Bayern are large and not the best protected, and tend to be damaged easily. Elevator fires in combination with this tend to lead you to a very fast death, sometimes within seconds of a fire starting. And adding to the lack of survivability, you have an average crew count for 7.0 battleships. It's really nothing standout. You still have no torpedo protection, relying mainly on your belt armor to soak up the torpedo damage, and tends to detonate due to the large magazine size if you do take a torpedo anyway. On top of that, you have virtually no anti-aircraft guns. The two 88mm anti-aircraft guns that you do have will engage blue water vessels, but really don't tend to do much against planes, just because they lack the rate of fire and the amount of anti-aircraft firepower that other battleships would have. As far as your main battery is concerned, you get 8 38cm guns in 4 twin turrets, with 2 super firing forward and 2 super firing aft. They have the same good rotation speed that you are used to, but they lose much of the previous reload speed as it's increased to 30 seconds. This is still faster than many of the other 7.0 large gun battleships, but not as significantly as what you had before. These do have great firing arcs, being able to heavily angle the ship while still engaging with all 4 main turrets, even better so than Derfflingers. The shells, however, do feel much slower and floatier and plunge more at ranges beyond 10 kilometers. They tend to also spread horizontally a lot and dislike penetrating angled targets at longer ranges, making fighting other battleships rather annoying. They are great shells for brawling though within about 8 kilometers, as they will fly flat and penetrate most on-par targets relatively easily. The shells themselves did gain a significant amount of penetration over the previous battleships, and the armor-piercing shells doubled in explosive filler, giving them a very large explosive mass. It does also get semi-armor piercing shells as stock shells, but I recommend researching and primarily using the armor piercing, since you will face mostly battleships that can resist the semi-armor piercing easily. Thankfully on this ship you do not need to fill your ammo storage due to the slower reload speed, so you don't have to max out those very easily detonatable magazines. The secondaries on this ship are the same great 150mm secondary guns that you've had since Westfalen, and you get 16 of them in casemates with 8 per side. You can keep most of them on target while you angle as well, making for a very effective secondary battery. You also can get hull-mounted torpedoes, which could have their uses, but they are slow and I'm not a fan of bringing them on an already detonation-prone ship. On top of that all, you do not get a hydroplane to take objectives, so a lot of times you'll just have to sail there aimlessly while people take them instead. So my rating for this is a 5 out of 10. The brawling with it is fun, but you're likely to explode before you can even get there on the larger maps. After that, we have the Ersatz Yorck at 7.0. This is basically a bigger, up-armored and upgunned Derfflinger. Despite being bigger, it keeps a similar speed to Derfflinger, which is much better than battleships at the tier, but tends to be slower than most other battle cruisers that are around the same battle rating. It does have wide and lengthy turns, much wider than anything else in the German tree thus far, but is fairly responsive to the rudder compared to something like Bayern, making it a lot easier to dodge with it. It does lose a decent amount of armor across major components compared to Bayern, but it doesn't leave much unarmored, leaving you a lot more resistant to high explosive spam, for example, or secondaries from other battleships. While most ships can penetrate your armor, it does bounce some shells and can make it feel tougher and more forgiving compared to other battlecruisers at 7.0 that would just explode in similar situations. Much like Derfflinger, the extremely long and empty bow and stern act as great spaced armor when pointing directly at enemies as well. One significant downside to your survivability is you have the same large size magazines as Bayern, and they are less protected, but you at least have the maneuverability with this ship to dodge enemy fire. Fires themselves are still a significant problem due to the short ammo elevators though. On the plus side, the hull has a lot of empty spaces without modules to damage, and the gap between the aft turrets can throw people off if they're just trying to aim for your magazines and end up hitting empty space instead. The ship doesn't have any torpedo protection but can tank them if not landed on the magazines, especially if the empty bow or stern is hit. The crew on this ship is much larger than Bayern, putting it on par with other 7.0 battleships and can feel much more survivable due to it. As far as your anti-aircraft guns go, you get 8 88mm anti-aircraft guns, and while they can score hits sometimes, I wouldn't rely on them. They will, however, engage blue water ships, even if they aren't doing too much to them. As far as your main battery is concerned, you have the same guns, turrets, and shells as Bayern, which are still great for brawling, and now you have the speed to get to those closer ranges. The firing arcs on this are slightly worse than Bayern, but are still great, allowing the ship to be heavily angled and still using all of its turrets. As far as your secondaries go, you get 12 of the 150mm secondaries that you've had since Westfalen, and are still great. 6 of these per size in casemates, and while you're angled you can still get 4 on targets forward, but if you're aiming to the rear you can only engage with 2 on that side of the ship. This is another ship that could have a use case for the torpedoes now that you have the speed to force brawls, but the torpedoes themselves are still slow and hull mounted, so I prefer not taking them. You also don't have a hydroplane to take objectives if required. Overall, my rating for this ship is a 6 out of 10. It's certainly better than Bayern, even if the guns still let it down at times. Rounding off the 7.0s, we have the SMS Sachsen, and it's a Bayern with 6 extra 88mm anti-aircraft guns. which still isn't enough to save you from just being bombed. That's it. They literally just slapped on a couple more anti-aircraft guns. Rating overall for this is a 4 out of 10. It gets -1 point for making me grind the same unfolded ship twice. Up next at 7.3 we have the Scharnhorst. This is the old king of top tier, and it's still rather strong despite many naval changes negatively affecting it. This battle cruiser is fast, keeping up with most cruisers, though it does take a while to get to full speed or decelerate due to its large size. It is, however, very responsive to the rudder, but does have a wide turning circle. It also can list and prevent the guns from firing in super hard turns. While it does look less armored than ships preceding it due to the stat card, the armor scheme itself prevents many ships from even scratching you, and the turtleback armor stops most shells that penetrate from damaging major components. It is super effective when angled, but it does falter when faced with 15-inch or larger battleship shells. It's very rare to take penetrations to the magazines despite the large magazine size and being right at the waterline though. Much like the Ersatz Yorck, the long bow section can act as spaced armor when pointed directly at an enemy ship, further increasing your survivability. The Scharnhorst, however, has no torpedo protection, but the thick armor belt and fuel tank locations make you surprisingly survivable against torpedoes. The biggest threat to this ship is fires in the turrets and ammo elevators, due to the short ammo elevators being able to spread fires to the magazines rather quickly. Sometimes this can take only one fire to detonate you, other times your ship can tank 4 or 5 before the magazines have had enough punishment. It's very hit or miss. The Scharnhorst also has a large crew complement, being on par or larger than many of the 7.7 battleships, making it extremely tanky for a 7.3. Along with that, your anti-aircraft battery can be rather effective at taking out planes. The 10.5 centimeter anti-aircraft guns will engage at extremely long ranges before planes are even spotted, and can engage blue water targets while there are no planes to swap. They are backed up by a decent complement of quick-firing cannons that will engage at medium ranges. As far as your main battery is concerned, you get 9 283mm guns in 3 triple turrets, with 2 super firing forward and 1 aft. These are extremely fast to traverse for a battleship, almost on par with the late German cruisers. It gets an extremely fast rate of fire on top of that, boasting an 18-second reload with an expert crew. The angles of fire with these turrets are good, but not as great as the previous ships, but you have much better maneuverability to angle up between shots. Another thing to keep in mind is that your first turret can be blocked by the bow in close range bow-on fights, so you do want to stay at least a little bit angled to an opposing enemy ship at closer ranges. The shells from these turrets are fast with relatively flat shell arcs, and while they're not the most accurate, they do seem better than the preceding battleships. They are similar in penetration to the larger shells of previous battleships. Still not great at range or against angled targets, but the much faster rate of fire and the maneuverability helps you overcome these issues, as you can either relentlessly shell a target to pieces or close the distance quickly to brawl. As far as shell choices, I prefer taking primarily armor piercing, as the semi-armor piercing severely lacks penetration to even scratch other battleships, especially when even the armor piercing tends not to damage heavily armored targets outside of brawling ranges or weak spots. These guns also can kind of feel like you're not dealing much damage due to these smaller shells, despite being relatively easily able to get into brawling range and make them much more effective. As far as your secondaries are concerned, you get 12 15cm secondaries in both twin enclosed turrets and single shielded turrets, with a total of 6 barrels per side and good arcs of fire. These are a general improvement over the 150mm secondaries of the previous ships, with more penetration, a faster 8-second reload, faster velocity, and slightly more explosive filler. I still suggest taking the armor piercing shells for these, as they are very effective. Overall, great battleship secondaries despite the somewhat slow rate of fire compared to other nations. The secondaries, however, will tend to be destroyed a lot, especially the single shielded turrets that kind of sit in the middle of your ship. You do get 2 triple torpedo launchers with 1 per side with good arcs of fire. You carry 14 torpedoes for a total of a full reload and a bonus torp for each launcher. These are the standard OK German torpedoes, and like other German ships, the torpedo mode modification is optional depending on if you want 6-kilometer torpedoes for brawling or 14-kilometer torpedoes to just lob at enemy teams. It also gets a hydroplane to help take objectives or scout out targets. My rating overall is an 8 out of 10. She may have been nerfed indirectly by changes, but the Scharnhorst is still a very fun ship. And lastly, to round off the line, we come to the Bismarck at 8.3. The new king of the German lineup certainly does not disappoint. Despite being almost twice the size, Bismarck is barely slower than Scharnhorst, though it does take a lot longer to accelerate or decelerate due to that increased size. The turning and rudder response also feels very similar, as well as the turning circle being very close to Scharnhorst's. Overall, Bismarck feels very good in terms of maneuverability. The armor on top of that adds to the extremely effective armor scheme of Scharnhorst, mostly beefing up the thinner portions along the belt armor, while not increasing the thickness of the belt itself. The turtleback armor and the bulkheads are beefed up as well, making you a lot more survivable to shells that would normally penetrate Scharnhorst. You can definitely take more of a pounding than Scharn's armor could, though heavier shells, especially from the new 8.7 battleships, may find it fairly simple to punch right through, just to deal damage to, say, your elevators. You can, however, show a broadside or do complete turns while under fire, and this isn't something I could say about most ships without, that ship sinking the enemy ship firing on them first, or really planning out your turn so that you don't take a hit to your vulnerable components. I will say, however, I haven't taken hits from Yamato in this ship, but Sovietsky seems to mainly just set you on fire and doesn't seem to be able to penetrate to your magazines or engines. I haven't faced a lot of them yet, so I don't really want to say for sure. Bismarck doesn't have any torpedo protection. Once again, you're relying on your belt armor and fuel tanks to soak up the damage, and ammo elevator fires are still your biggest threat, but Bismarck seems to be more resistant to them than previous battleships, as you can tank a lot more of them and not have them spread straight to your magazines a lot more consistently than, say, Scharnhorst could. Adding to the survivability, you also have a very large crew complement, being only matched or outdone by the American high-tier battleships and Yamato. As far as your anti-aircraft batteries are concerned, it is slightly improved from Scharnhorst and can be effective, but Bismarck faces faster planes that aren't that bothered by it. The 10.5 centimeter guns will still engage beyond spotting ranges, or fire on blue water ships, which is always a nice touch. The main battery on Bismarck consists of 8 38cm guns in 4 twin turrets with 2 super firing forward and 2 super firing aft. The traverse is only a bit slower than Scharnhorst, so extremely good for battleships. You also have a good rate of fire as well, boasting a 24-second reload with an expert crew. The firing arcs on these are decent as well, letting you stay angled while engaging with all her guns, but maneuvering in between shots is suggested to angle your armor even more, as your good rudder response makes it fairly easy to do. The shells themselves are slower than Scharnhorst's and have more of an arc to them, but still are quite fast, especially at brawling ranges. This means less time for the enemy to react to your shells before they land, and the guns themselves do seem to be a lot more accurate than previous ships, being able to nail weak spots a lot more efficiently. The shells do have significantly better penetration over anything else in the tech tree and can penetrate most targets reliably, though they do tend to struggle to damage the 8.7 battleships based on my limited experience fighting them. The shells boast a large explosive mass, which tends to decimate anything that they do dig into, and will readily pop shell rooms and magazines on enemy battleships. They do seem to be effective at all ranges, and you don't need to brawl to see results, which is a major change from the previous battleships. Personally, I only take the armor-piercing rounds, but I could see some use case for the semi-armor piercing shells, as they boast similar penetration to the previous battleship's armor-piercing rounds, but have almost twice the explosive filler of Bismarck's armor-piercing rounds. They could be devastating against battleships that you could reliably penetrate with Scharnhorst or the Bayerns. As far as the secondaries go, you have the same secondaries and the same amount of them as Scharnhorst, although Bismarcks are all in enclosed twin turrets with 3 turrets per side. These have great angles of fire and can typically always engage with all 3 on whichever side your target is on. Bismarck doesn't, however, get any torpedoes, despite the line typically having them as a standard thus far, which is kind of a detraction in my opinion, though it does get a float plane to help you snag objectives. My rating overall for the Bismarck is a 10 out of 10. It tanks hits like it's nothing, and it has the firepower to return the favor. And that's it for the German line review for now. I'm sure Gaijin will mix things up by changing battle ratings or adding in a few extra ships as soon as I release this. But overall, despite this line having some weak points, I really enjoyed it, and I think it does pay off heavily in the end. Hopefully you guys found this helpful, and good luck out there. I'll see you in the next one.